meeting, as it turned out, was exactly as Hannah had predicted. She spent the whole time half listening and trying to ignore the slightly throbbing pain in the middle of her back. The fact that her chair wasn't well cushioned didn't help much. She was relieved when the meeting was closed and she was able to get up. She was about to split for the city again when her father stopped her just outside the meeting room. "What were you doing this morning?" he asked quietly. "I just went for a bit of a run," she said. "You've been encouraging me to get some proper exercise for ages, so I thought I'd follow your advice." "And that's where you got this?" King Liam raised his eyebrows and gently tapped a bruise on Hannah's jaw. "I guess so," she said. "But it's just a bruise, nothing to worry about." "That's true," her father nodded. "That is just a bruise, but that," he gently whacked Hannah's mid-back, "that is a fracture. I know an injury when I see one. You think I wouldn't notice the way you couldn't sit still? You usually fall asleep in those meetings." "I felt like falling asleep," Hannah mumbled. King Liam put an arm around his daughter's shoulders. "Hannah, I know meetings are your least favorite thing, but it is important for our people to see that you are the devoted princess that they deserve. Don't you think you owe it to them?" Hannah ducked her eyes. He was right, as always. She shouldn't go throwing herself off buildings for the fun of it. Tomorrow she'd be 17, a year from becoming of age, and then would come the preparation to be a fully recognized heir to the kingdom. She didn't like it, but a lot of responsibility would be put on her shoulders. She'd seen Alex going through the same thing. He used to go with Hannah to play in the city with her friends, but after he turned 17 a lot more was expected of him, and he never went out with them anymore. Hannah didn't want the same thing to happen to her. Hannah didn't want that same thing to happen, but she also didn't want to disappoint the people, much less her father. She sighed and nodded. "That's my girl," King Liam smiled. "Now, why don't you go and find Julita? I'm sure she'd be able to fix her back in no time. Oh, and it would be wise not to tell her what you were really doing." Hannah laughed and headed down the corridor, glad that her father was so easygoing nowadays. When she was younger, he worried so much whenever she got hurt playing with her friends. But one day, when she was 13, her father had seen her triumph in a little wrestling match between her and one of the kitchen boys. Since then, he hadn't interfered with her wanderings, and even encouraged her to keep learning self-defense, as he called it. When Hannah found Julita, the older woman frowned at Hannah's refusal to tell how she got hurt. She chattered on about dangerous activities that were unfit for a princess to partake in, but after about an hour Hannah was feeling right as rain. As Hannah made for the door, Julita called out to her, "And don't even think of doing anything reckless today. I don't want to see you in my sick bay again." Hannah laughed to herself as she headed to the stables. She crossed the courtyard and stepped inside a sweet-smelling building. Earlier that morning, Jace had told them about a festival going on in Avorna, a city just an hour's ride north of Granite City. If it hadn't been for the meeting, Hannah would probably already be there with them. "Are you up for a ride?" For a good ride. Hannah stretched out her mind to her horse, Alonzo. She'd known how to talk to animals for as long as she could remember. She even suspected she could communicate with them before she could even talk properly. Alonzo burred. "We're going to be out all afternoon, aren't we?" "What would be the point of going otherwise?" Hannah climbed into the saddle and grinned widely as the two of them galloped out of the city. Just a year ago, Hannah never would have gotten away with this, just leaving for the afternoon to do whatever she pleased. Up until she turned 16, she'd been heavily immersed in all-day lessons. Everything that anyone could think of to train her up to one day to be a proper ruler. Everything that anyone could think of to train her up to one day be a proper ruler. Hannah didn't really see the point of it. Alex was crown prince, and he'd be king of Hearseth once he got married, and that was probably going to happen soon. He and Princess Isabel from Surtesh were more than a little friendly of late. But when Hannah finished her lessons, 11 months sooner than expected, she had sunk into a lull that went between learning to be a leader and actually being one. She wasn't expected to do much duty-wise until she was 17, and Hannah was bent on enjoying her last full day of freedom. The ride north was a pleasant one on such a warm day. There was a nice breeze that toyed with the long grass on either side of the road, creating the illusion that Hannah was riding through a pale green ocean. Trees were graciously spaced throughout the plain, some clustered in large branches and others standing tall and alone. High overhead, a trio of white-chested ravens circled and called to each other. As she traveled, Hannah munched on an orange that she'd nicked from the kitchens on her way to the stables. She loved the fruit, and when she was younger she'd often been found with her hands white and dry from the peels. Oranges usually grew best in the winter, but the nature mages who cared for the orchards had mastered a way to grow them plump and juicy year-round.